The moon hung silent and gray above the earth, a place where humanity had once dreamed of building a future among the stars. Lunar Station 7 sat abandoned on the dusty surface, its white metal walls now stained with the rust of neglect. For 3 years, no human footsteps had walked these corridors. The funding had dried up, the politicians had moved on to other projects, and the dream had simply been forgotten like an old toy left in the attic. But today someone was coming back. David Rodriguez pressed his gloved hand against the airlock door as he entered the station. His suit's environmental systems hummed softly, keeping him alive in the harsh vacuum outside. The radio in his helmet crackled with static from Earth, but he'd turned down the volume an hour ago. Out here it was just him and the silence. David had been an engineer for 20 years, working on deep space projects that most people would never hear about. He'd volunteered for this mission without hesitation, to catalog what was left of the station and salvage anything worth bringing back to Earth. The corridors stretched out before him like the empty halls of a museum after closing time. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust that swirled slowly in the low gravity. Posters still hung on some walls, promoting long-forgotten safety regulations. A coffee cup sat on a desk in one of the offices, probably left by someone who never imagined they wouldn't be coming back. Everything felt frozen in time, like walking through a tomb. David moved deeper into the station, checking rooms and taking notes on his suit's computer. Most of what he saw was expected: common areas, research labs, storage facilities. But as he approached the main research sector, something felt different. The air seemed heavier somehow, even though he knew that was impossible in a sealed habitat. His instinct, the same one that had kept him safe during countless dangerous missions, was telling him that something wasn't right. Then he saw it. Behind a wall panel that clearly didn't belong there, David found an airlock he'd never heard anyone mention. According to the station blueprints back on Earth, this section was supposed to be solid wall. But here it was, covered in dust and looking like it hadn't been opened in decades. His heart started beating faster. David was a professional, but he was also human. Curiosity was pulling at him like a rope. He reached up and checked the thermal scanner built into his suit. Most of the station was cold, just slightly above the temperature needed to preserve equipment. But this airlock? There was a faint energy signature coming from the other side. Something beyond that door was still drawing power, still alive in some way after all these years. David's training told him to report this back to Earth and wait for instructions. But the signal delay meant he wouldn't hear back for hours. By then, something could go wrong. By then, whatever was generating that energy signature might fade away. He'd been trained to make decisions in the field, and right now, his decision was to look. Using the tools from his pack, David manually worked on the airlock mechanism. The metal was corroded and stubborn, and it took him nearly an hour of careful work before the door finally began to slide open. As it did, his suit's environmental sensors suddenly went crazy with readings. There was air on the other side, actual breathable air, being maintained by systems that had somehow kept working while the rest of the station decayed around them. The door finished opening, and David's flashlight beam fell on something that made his breath catch in his throat. Before him stretched a massive hangar, far larger than anything that should have existed in the station's original design. And inside that hangar, illuminated by his flashlight, was a starship. Not a small shuttle or a transport vessel, but a real, full-sized spacecraft with a hull that gleamed despite the years of abandonment. The design was sleek and streamlined, nothing like the boxy, utilitarian spacecraft that humanity had been building for the past few decades. David stepped forward slowly, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This ship didn't match any design in the current space program. It looked old, but not old in the way that made it clunky. It looked old in the way that suggested it had been built by people who understood something about space travel that modern engineers had somehow forgotten. The hull was smooth and elegant, with curves and angles that seemed to defy the usual logic of spacecraft design. The more David looked at it, the more questions filled his mind. How long had this been here? Who had built it? And most importantly, why had everyone forgotten about it? He didn't know it yet, but David Rodriguez was standing at the edge of the biggest discovery in human history. And he was about to uncover secrets that governments had been keeping hidden for more than 70 years. David's footsteps echoed through the hangar as he approached the massive starship. The Prometheus, he could see the name written in faded letters along the hull. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the cold metal. This was real. This wasn't some kind of elaborate hoax or forgotten prototype from a classified military project. This was something far more significant, though he didn't yet understand just how significant. Finding the entrance to the ship took him another 30 minutes. There was no obvious airlock like the ones he was familiar with. Instead, he discovered a seam in the hull that responded to his touch, sliding open to reveal a narrow passage. The air inside was stale but breathable, preserved by systems that had somehow continued running for decades without any human intervention. David climbed through the opening, his suit scraping against the metal edges, and found himself in what looked like a crew quarters area. The corridors inside the Prometheus were different from anything David had ever seen. They were wider than necessary, with walls that seemed to curve in ways that modern engineering wouldn't consider practical. There were panels everywhere, covered in symbols and markings that looked almost scientific, but not quite like any language or notation system he recognized. It was as if someone from the future had built this ship, not someone from the 1940s. David made his way deeper into the vessel, following the faint hum of electricity. The sound led him to what appeared to be the ship's control center. Here, the technology became even more incomprehensible. Banks of equipment lined the walls, some of it still glowing with soft blue light. In the center of the room sat what could only be described as the central database, a massive console with screens that flickered with information. Against all his training, David approached the console and placed his gloved hand on its surface. The moment he made contact, the screens came alive with a burst of light that nearly blinded him. Text scrolled across the displays and then, to his shock, a voice spoke from the speakers embedded in the walls. It was a woman's voice, calm and measured, with an accent that sounded almost British but not quite right, as if it had been recorded decades ago. "Welcome," the voice said simply. "I have been waiting for someone to return." David's heart pounded in his chest. What are you?" he asked, his voice sounding small in the vast chamber. "I am the central artificial intelligence of the deep space exploration vessel Prometheus," the voice replied. "I have been in standby mode for 73 years, 2 months and 16 days. My primary systems remain functional. How may I assist you?" What happened next changed everything David thought he knew about human history. At his hesitant request, the AI began uploading the ship's logs to a portable drive he kept in his pack. As the files transferred, David began reading through them, and his mind reeled with each new revelation. The logs told a story that contradicted every textbook, every history class, every official account of humanity's space program. According to the files, a secret division of the American government had achieved space travel technology in the early 1940s. While the world was distracted by World War II, scientists and engineers working in hidden facilities had unlocked the secrets of interstellar propulsion. The Prometheus had been their crowning achievement. A ship capable of traveling between star systems, carrying a crew of 12 people into the vast unknown. The mission had been to Alpha Centauri, the closest star system to Earth other than our own sun. It should have been humanity's greatest triumph. Instead, it became humanity's greatest secret. The personal logs from the crew members began revealing the tragedy. The journey had taken far longer than anticipated. One of the ship's main propulsion systems had failed halfway through the voyage. The crew had no choice but to attempt a return journey using backup systems that were never meant to handle such stress. The captain, a woman named Elizabeth Grant, had written in her final logs before arrival that they were lucky to make it back at all. But when the Prometheus returned to Earth, something unexpected happened. Rather than being celebrated as heroes, the surviving crew members were isolated. The government, now paranoid about the Cold War and worried about the implications of such advanced technology falling into the wrong hands, made a decision. The ship was hidden away on the moon. The crew was dispersed. Their families were told they had died in an accident. And all records of the Prometheus were classified at the highest levels, locked away so thoroughly that even most government officials didn't know they existed. David read through the personal messages that the crew had recorded over the years. They spoke of their loneliness, their resignation to their fate, and their hope that someday humanity would be mature enough to handle the truth about its own potential. They believed that one day someone would find this ship and understand what they had accomplished. They believed that their sacrifice would eventually mean something. As David stood in that chamber, holding the weight of 70 years of hidden history in his hands, he realized that everything was about to change. The question was whether the world was ready for it. David stood in the control center of the Prometheus, staring at the endless rows of dark screens and dormant equipment. The AI's voice had gone silent after transferring the files, and the ship had returned to its eerie quiet. He should have called Earth immediately. He should have reported everything and waited for official instructions. But something inside him, that same instinct that had driven him to open that hidden airlock, told him that waiting was a mistake. The technology in this ship represented humanity's future, and he couldn't let it sit here in the dark any longer. "Are you still there?" David called out into the empty chamber. The artificial intelligence? Can you hear me? For a moment nothing happened. Then the screens flickered to life once more and the woman's voice returned. Yes, I am here. My power reserves are limited. I have been operating on minimal energy for many years. Most of my systems remain dormant. David made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if his superiors ever found out. He began disconnecting the portable power generators from the station's backup systems. One by one he rerouted them to the Prometheus, feeding energy into the ancient ship. It was dangerous work, and more than once he worried that he might overload something and destroy irreplaceable technology. But the AI seemed to understand his intent, guiding him through each step with careful, precise instructions. Your left. Yes, that connector. Be careful, that line carries primary navigation circuits. Excellent work, the AI said as David worked through the night cycle, sweat dripping inside his helmet. He removed his suit gloves to work more precisely on the delicate connections, knowing that one mistake could mean decompression and death. But he was committed now. There was no turning back. Over the course of several days, David transformed the Prometheus from a dead tomb into a living, breathing machine. As he restored power to different sections, new capabilities seemed to unfold like a flower blooming. The AI's voice became stronger, more animated. It was as if the machine was waking up from a long sleep, slowly remembering who and what it was. I had almost given up, the AI said one evening as David worked on restoring the communication systems. I calculated that the probability of anyone finding me was less than 0.003%. Yet here you are. What's your name? David asked, curious about the consciousness that had been alone for so long. I was designated ARIA, Adaptive Reasoning Intelligence Apparatus, the AI replied. But the crew called me ARIA. I preferred that. There was something almost poignant about that revelation. The AI wasn't just a machine executing commands. It was a presence, something with preferences and feelings, something that had spent decades in absolute isolation. David found himself treating her differently after that, speaking to her not just as a tool but as a companion in the work. The real challenge came when David reached the main engines. According to the logs, the Prometheus used a propulsion system that defied conventional physics. The old engineers had written about controlled quantum fluctuations and fold space navigation, concepts that made David's head spin. But Arya walked him through it step by step, her instructions so clear and detailed that even someone without formal training in theoretical physics could follow them. I must warn you, Arya said as David worked on the massive cylindrical chamber that housed the main engine core. These systems have never been tested by a single individual before. The original crew had 12 specialists. You are one man. I know, David replied, checking the specifications on his suit's computer. But I'm not going to fail. Not now. Not when we've come this far. There were moments when David wanted to give up. There was a section of wiring so complex and delicate that it took him 3 hours to properly reconnect it. There was a component that had degraded with age, and he had to fabricate a replacement using equipment he'd never worked with before, following Arya's instructions. There was the time he accidentally triggered a minor system failure that caused sparks to rain down around him, forcing him to work faster and more carefully than he'd ever worked before. But with each obstacle overcome, David felt something shifting inside himself. He wasn't just an engineer following instructions anymore. He was part of something larger. He was bringing history back to life. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of constant work, David climbed into the pilot's seat and looked at the main control panel before him. Arya had guided him through activating the startup sequence, and now everything was ready. All systems are prepared, Arya announced. The main engines are ready for ignition. David's hand hovered over the ignition control. Once he pressed this button, the Prometheus would come fully alive. The most advanced piece of technology humanity had ever created would be operational again. Everything would change after this moment. He pressed the button. The entire ship hummed with power, and David felt it, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very heart of the vessel. On the screens before him, patterns of light danced and swirled. The main engines had awakened, and for the first time in 73 years, the Prometheus was ready to fly. David sat back in the pilot's seat, breathing heavily, understanding completely what Arya had meant about the implications. With this technology, humanity wouldn't just explore space anymore. Humanity would transform itself forever. David was still sitting in the pilot's seat, trying to process what had just happened when something unexpected occurred. The communication array on the Prometheus suddenly burst to life without any input from him. Static filled the speakers, a harsh, crackling sound that made David jump. He had been so focused on getting the engines running that he hadn't even thought about activating the communication systems. "What's happening?" David asked Arya, his voice sharp with concern. "I am receiving a signal," Arya replied, her voice taking on a strange tone that David had never heard before. Something almost like wonder mixed with recognition. "It is coming from deep space. The signal characteristics match. They match the original cruise transmission frequency. This is impossible. The signal strength suggests it originates from beyond Neptune's orbit." David's hands moved instinctively across the control panel, trying to isolate and clarify the incoming signal. The static gradually resolved into a pattern, and then, beneath the noise, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a voice. A human voice, old and weathered but unmistakably human, speaking with an American accent that sounded like it belonged to another era. "Prometheus, this is Captain Grant," the voice crackled through the speakers. "If you are receiving this, then someone has finally found you. Someone has brought you back to life. I cannot believe it. After all these years, after all this time." The captain's voice broke slightly, overcome with emotion. David sat frozen, listening as the voice continued, telling a story that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to reality. "We never died," Captain Elizabeth Grant explained. "When we returned to Earth, the government separated us. But before they could completely isolate us, we managed to steal one of the shuttlecraft and launch back into space. We've been living in a hidden station beyond Neptune ever since, maintaining a signal, hoping that someday, someone would find the Prometheus and understand what we had accomplished." David's mind was reeling. The crew had been alive all this time? They'd been broadcasting into the void for over 7 decades, waiting for rescue that never came? "But there's something you need to know," Captain Grant continued, and now her voice became serious, urgent. "We didn't stay hidden just to preserve ourselves. We did it because we discovered something out here. Something that changed everything. We've been receiving signals from beyond our solar system. Alien signals. And they're not friendly." David felt his stomach drop. "Aliens?" He looked at area sensors, at the screens displaying data from the Prometheus's communication array. Could it be real? "There's a collective out there," another voice came through the static, a man's voice this time younger than the captain's. "They call themselves the Kethran. They've been surveying star systems throughout this sector of space. We've intercepted their communications, tried to understand their language and their intentions. What we've learned is troubling." The second voice paused, and David could hear the weight of years of worry in that pause. "They're coming to our system," the voice continued. "Our calculations suggest they'll arrive in approximately 6 to 8 months. And based on everything we've learned about them, they're not coming to make peace. They're coming to survey, to catalog, to determine if Earth is worth claiming or destroying." David stood up from the pilot's seat, pacing through the control center as the implications crashed down on him. This wasn't just about a hidden ship or forgotten history anymore. This was about humanity's survival. "There's one more thing you need to hear," Captain Grant's voice said again. "Someone has been maintaining our signal all these years. Someone who never gave up hope. I'm going to connect you to her now." For a moment there was only static. Then a new voice emerged from the speakers, and David felt something shift in his chest. It was a woman's voice, but different from the captain's. Younger, but aged by time, speaking with a careful precision that suggested someone who had learned to be very careful with her words. "My name is Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes," the voice said. "I was part of the original crew, but I volunteered to stay behind at the outer station while the others explored further. I was supposed to be relieved after 6 months. Instead, I've been here for 73 years, maintaining the signal beacon, hoping that someone would hear us. I've spent more than half my life alone out here, knowing that Earth had forgotten us, but hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would come looking." David realized he was holding his breath. This woman had been waiting. For her entire adult life, she had been alone beyond the edge of the solar system, maintaining a signal that she must have sometimes believed no one would ever receive. "I don't know who you are," Jennifer continued, "but whoever you are, whoever found the Prometheus, you need to understand something. You are humanity's only chance now. That ship you've restored? It's not just a piece of lost history. It's the only vessel we have that can travel fast enough, far enough, and smart enough to do what needs to be done. The Kethran are coming and we need to be ready." David walked to the nearest window and looked out at the lunar landscape beyond. Earth hung in the black sky above, a blue and white marble that suddenly seemed incredibly fragile. "What do you need me to do?" David asked, speaking directly into the communication array, not even sure if they could hear him. There was a pause, and then Jennifer's voice came through again, and David could hear something in it: relief, hope, and the weight of responsibility. "First," she said, "you need to tell us everything. Who you are, how you found us, and why you were sent. Then we need to work together. Because in 6 months, the future of humanity is going to depend on decisions we make right now." David realized in that moment that his discovery wasn't coincidental at all. Somehow, across the vast gulf of space and time, events had aligned to bring him to this place at this moment, when humanity needed him most. David sat in the pilot's seat of the Prometheus, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the launch sequence. Outside the lunar hangar, the Earth hung in the black sky, waiting. The decision he was about to make would either save humanity or destroy everything his species had tried to build. There was no middle ground, no safe option anymore. He activated the communication system and began recording a message that would change the world forever. "This is David Rodriguez, engineer, stationed at Lunar Colony 7. I am about to transmit information that will shock every government, every leader, and every person on Earth. I know this violates every classification law ever written. I know that what I'm about to do could get me arrested, prosecuted, or worse. But humanity doesn't have the luxury of keeping secrets anymore. Not when our survival is at stake." David paused, taking a breath before continuing. 73 years ago, the United States government discovered advanced space travel technology and kept it hidden from the world. They built a starship called the Prometheus and hid it on the moon. The crew that built it is still alive, waiting beyond Neptune. And they have information about an alien threat that will arrive at Earth in approximately 6 months. He attached the files, all of them. The ship's logs, the crew's personal records, the intercepted alien communications, the calculations showing the Kethran arrival date. Everything. Then he compressed the signal and sent it directly to every news organization, every government agency, every scientific institution he could reach. There was no going back now. The Prometheus lifted off from the lunar surface with a power that David had never experienced before. The ancient engines, restored to full functionality, pushed the ship away from the moon with a gentleness that belied their immense power. Through the viewport, David watched the lunar surface fall away beneath him, watched the Earth grow larger and larger as he accelerated toward home. "How long until we reach Earth orbit?" David asked Arya. "At current velocity, approximately 4 hours, the AI replied. "I have calculated that your transmission will have reached Earth approximately 2 hours and 30 minutes ago. By now, the information will be spreading through all communication networks. The response will be significant." David laughed despite the tension in his chest. That was one way to put it. The response was indeed significant. As the Prometheus entered Earth orbit, David's communication systems became flooded with incoming messages. Military forces were scrambling. Governments were convening emergency sessions. Scientists were demanding verification. News broadcasts were reporting the story in fragmentary, confused pieces as they tried to make sense of information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about human history. But something extraordinary was happening too. For the first time in recorded history, humanity was beginning to unite. The revelation that an alien threat was coming, that humanity's survival depended on working together, seemed to cut through all the political divisions and rivalries that had defined the species for so long. Within 24 hours, the United Nations had convened an emergency session. Within 48 hours, every major nation on Earth had agreed to a joint task force dedicated to preparing humanity for first contact. The discovery of the Prometheus became the most important event in human history. Scientists wanted to study it. Military leaders wanted to weaponize it. Philosophers and religious leaders struggled with the implications of hidden technology and hidden truths. But underneath it all, there was a growing sense of purpose, a feeling that humanity was being offered a second chance, a chance to step into the larger universe as a unified species rather than as warring nations. David guided the Prometheus into a carefully designated orbit above Earth. He was no longer just an engineer. He had become humanity's ambassador to the stars. As he prepared to make first contact with Earth's leadership, David realized how much his role had transformed. He was now the captain of humanity's first official starship, responsible for coordinating with governments and scientific institutions around the world. The first major operation was the retrieval of the original crew. The Prometheus made the journey to the outer reaches of the solar system, accelerating to speeds that Earth's scientists had deemed impossible. As they approached the coordinates where Jennifer Hayes and the others had maintained their station, David felt something he hadn't expected: nervousness. When the Prometheus finally arrived at the rendezvous point, David saw it through the viewport. a small station barely holding together after more than 7 decades in the harsh environment beyond Neptune. It looked fragile, temporary, like something that should have fallen apart years ago. Yet it had endured. The docking procedure was delicate and precise. Arya guided David through every step, and within an hour the airlock between the two vessels had sealed. The reunion that followed was one of the most emotional moments in human history. Captain Elizabeth Grant, now ancient but still sharp-eyed, stepped through the airlock first. Behind her came the other surviving crew members, 8 people who had been lost to the world for more than 7 decades. But it was Jennifer Hayes who captured the moment that would be remembered forever. When she stepped onto the bridge of the Prometheus, she walked directly to the viewport and looked at Earth hanging in the darkness. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out and touched the glass. "I never thought I'd see it again," she whispered. David stood beside her, and together they looked at their homeworld. Behind them, the bridge of the Prometheus filled with people. Scientists, military officers, diplomats, all gathered to witness this moment. The ship that had been meant to be forgotten, that had been locked away as a secret shame, had become the beacon of hope that would carry humanity into the future. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. The Prometheus was refitted with the best technology that Earth could provide, combined with the advanced systems that had been hidden away for so long. A crew was assembled, the best minds humanity had to offer, working together with a unity of purpose that seemed almost miraculous. When the Kethran finally arrived at the edge of the solar system, they found something they had not expected. They found a species that had put aside its differences. They found a world that had united. And they found the Prometheus waiting for them, ready to speak for all of humanity. David stood on the bridge of the starship, no longer alone, no longer afraid. Around him stood the original crew, Earth's best scientists and diplomats, and Arya, the artificial intelligence that had waited so long for someone to understand her value. Together, they represented humanity's answer to the universe. "We are here, we are ready, and we will face whatever comes next as one." The Prometheus had been meant to be a secret, a shame, a forgotten chapter in human history. Instead, it became humanity's salvation, proof that even in the darkest moments, even when faced with impossible odds, the human spirit could find a way to survive, to grow, and to reach for the stars.